There is a painting from the 18th century in which the sky appears almost layered, not simply clouds drifting across blue, but structured forms, bands of light, dense textures, gradients that feel too deliberate to be random. The horizon glows with a soft intensity, while above it, the sky seems to fold into itself, as if arranged in subtle tiers. At first glance, it is easy to attribute this to artistic style. Painters of that era often emphasized the atmosphere, dramatized light, and interpreted nature through a personal lens. The sky was not just background, it was expression. And yet, when you begin to look beyond a single painting, something more consistent begins to emerge across different regions, different artists, and different decades. Similar skies appear, not identical, but comparable. Layered, textured, sometimes unusually luminous, and occasionally structured in ways that feel unfamiliar. The official explanation is straightforward. Art is not photography. It reflects interpretation, not replication. Painters exaggerated what they saw, simplified what they didn't, and composed scenes in ways that enhanced emotion or narrative. This explains a great deal. But then, the timeline shifts. With the arrival of early photography in the 19th century, the expectation changes. Cameras, even in their earliest forms, are assumed to capture reality more directly. Less interpretation, more documentation. And yet, in some of these early photographs, the sky still feels different. In long exposure images, clouds appear stretched, almost smeared across the frame. Light behaves in ways that are difficult to fully interpret, bright in some areas, unexpectedly dim in others. The sky often lacks the sharp definition we are used to today, replaced instead by gradients that seem softer, less predictable. This, too, has an explanation. Early cameras required long exposure times. The sky, being bright and dynamic, often overexposed or blurred. Cloud movement during the exposure created streaks and distortions. The technology imposed its own limitations on what could be captured, and again, this is valid. But as with the paintings, the pattern extends beyond a single cause, because even when accounting for exposure limitations, certain qualities remain consistent across different images. The sky often appears less uniform, less standardized, more varied. There are photographs where the horizon glows with a density of light that feels almost tangible. Others, where clouds form layered bands that resemble waves more than vapor. In some cases, the contrast between sky and land is unusually pronounced, as if the atmosphere itself were thicker or more defined. None of this is impossible. Atmospheric conditions vary. Light behaves differently depending on humidity, particulate matter, and the angle of the sun. What we see in the sky is always a combination of physical processes. But when similar visual patterns appear across different places and time periods, it raises a quiet question. Were these conditions more common than they are today, or were they simply observed more carefully? There is also the matter of color. Written accounts from earlier centuries occasionally describe skies in ways that feel slightly unfamiliar, hues that shift rapidly, tones that seem deeper or more saturated than what is typically observed now, descriptions of sunsets that linger, of twilight that stretches longer than expected, of atmospheric effects that appear almost structured. These accounts are subjective. They rely on perception, on language, on memory, and yet they align at least in tone with the visual records. This does not suggest that the sky itself was fundamentally different, but it does suggest that its appearance may have varied in ways that are not always reflected in modern experience. There are possible explanations for this. Changes in air quality over time, variations in atmospheric composition, shifts in climate patterns, all of these can influence how light is scattered and perceived. Industrialization, for example, introduced particles into the atmosphere that altered the color of sunsets in noticeable ways. So it is reasonable to consider that earlier environments may have produced different visual effects. But this leads to another layer of the question. If the sky did appear differently in the past, even subtly, how much of that difference has been documented, and how much has simply faded from common awareness? Because the sky is something we rarely question. It is constant, familiar, expected. We assume it has always looked more or less as it does now. And yet, the records both visual and written suggest that there may have been variations, not dramatic, not necessarily transformative, but noticeable, patterns that repeat just enough to draw attention, but not enough to form a clear conclusion. There is also the influence of observation itself. In earlier periods, without artificial lighting and constant visual distractions, the sky may have been observed more closely. Subtle changes, variations in light, shifts in color, these might have been more apparent simply because there was more time and attention given to them. This could account for the richness of description in older texts, but it does not fully explain the consistency of certain visual patterns across different sources, because consistency, even when subtle, suggests something shared, something experienced, something recorded, whether intentionally or not. And this is where the perspective begins to shift, not toward a definitive answer, but toward a broader consideration that the sky, like any part of the natural world, is not static. It changes, gradually, quietly, sometimes in ways that are difficult to notice in the moment, but become more apparent when viewed across longer spans of time. If that is the case, then the differences we observe in old records may not be anomalies. They may be variations, snapshots of atmospheric conditions that were once more common or simply more visible. But because those conditions are not part of our current experience, they appear unusual, almost unfamiliar, and perhaps that is what gives these images and descriptions their subtle sense of unease, not because they depict something impossible, but because they depict something that no longer feels typical, something that exists just outside our expectations. So when we look at these old paintings, these early photographs, these written accounts of the sky, the question is not necessarily whether they are accurate, it is whether they are complete, whether they capture a range of appearances that we no longer fully recognize. Because if the sky can change, if its colors, its textures, its patterns can shift over time, then what we consider normal may simply be a current version of something more dynamic, a moment within a longer cycle, and the records we have inherited may be fragments of that cycle, not explanations, but reminders that even the most familiar parts of our world are not fixed, that they evolve, often quietly, often without notice, and that sometimes the only trace of those changes is found not in what we see today, but in what was recorded long before we thought to compare,